at the ballot box. One of the other things about COVID is I think it has made life relatively hard for oppositions at all levels of government. It's very natural that as voters we're focused on the immediate response to a crisis, and the government of the day is of course leading that response and taking a lot of the airtime. But as I said at the start, now is exactly the time to be tackling the long-term policy challenges we face as a nation, putting all the options on the table. And a vibrant and strong opposition plays a really key role in making that a possibility. For this pandemic, I think we had a bit of a lost decade on the policy front. Parties on both sides were consumed by their internal rivalries and leadership battles. And unfortunately, we still see that playing out yet again. But I think, we've got challenges in declining productivity growth. We have a migration pause. We've got closed borders. We need to move towards decarbonisation and dealing with the impacts of climate change. And we need to make our economy more dynamic. The last time I interviewed the opposition leader, back in 2019, before the pandemic, we talked jobs, jobs, jobs. And now as we try to look into the recovery of the future, I think that's what a lot of our questions are going to boil down to. So today, Anthony Albanese is going to share the view from opposition, what should be the government's priorities between now and 2025. So please send your questions in. I want to see the themes that emerge. So now let's hear from opposition leader Anthony Albanese.
Well, thanks, Diane, and I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and use this and every opportunity to recommit to the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. After 18 months, none of us could have predicted, and none of us will ever forget, Australia has reached a crossroads. I believe if we act with courage and clarity of purpose, we can capitalise on the opportunities of this moment and harness them for the benefit of people and communities all over our country. If we make the right choices, we will one day be able to look back on the turbulence of the past 18 months, not just as an ordeal, but as a transformative period. But all of this depends on having the policies and the leadership to make this moment count. That urgency, that ambition is at the heart of the agenda that Labor will take to the next election. Our plans and policies are organised around three fundamental principles. One, to build an economy that delivers for working families. Two, investing in Australia's future. And three, ensuring that everyone can get ahead. Those are the clear values that drive our vision. And after 8 years, we know what the alternative looks like. We've heard it directly from the Prime Minister. It's not my problem. It's not my responsibility. I don't hold a hose. And in recent times, it's not a race. And now we have a new old Deputy Prime Minister in Barnaby Joyce. Spoiler alert here, Barnaby's the spoiler. And we saw that with the actions of the National Party in the Senate over water just in the last 24 hours. Laziness instead of leadership condemns us to emerge from this once-in-a-century crisis unchanged by the experience and uninterested in learning from it. And that road leads only to another lost decade of policy paralysis, wage stagnation and economic drift. Make no mistake, we are in a race to get vaccinated, a race to restore some security and normality to national life, a race to reopen international trade and revive export industries, and above and beyond all that, a race for the jobs and industries and markets and opportunities of the future, a race to secure Australia's destiny as a renewable energy superpower, as the skills and education capital of the Indo-Pacific, as a leader in advanced manufacturing and the region's pharmaceutical production hub. To win a race, you need to run forward into the future. But the current government is frightened of the present and terrified of the future. And now, with Barnaby Joyce's return to the Deputy Prime Ministership, we have a new element. They actually want to run backwards. And the problem isn't just that he's stuck in the past, it's that he wants the rest of Australia to go back there just to keep him company. I know Australia can win this race, but we can't sit back and wait for prosperity to land in our lap. At gatherings like this CEDA conference, when we talk about the shape of Australia's future, I also think we need to be mindful that for millions of Australians, the future has never seemed less certain. And I think today's new announcement, yet again on AstraZeneca, will just reinforce that anxiety. The way that Australians, though, have risen to the challenges of the pandemic has been nothing short of magnificent. When they have a government that backs them, the potential of our people is boundless. But this government has turned its back on so many. There are whole sectors of our economy, tourism, travel agents, higher education and the arts, practically switched off at the wall. With no clarity over what needs to happen for anything like business as usual to return, and no idea when that will be. Small businesses, restaurants and events suffering through lockdowns and restrictions and closures, including this one. Because there can be no long-term security from COVID-19 while quarantine is run out of city hotels built for tourists and only 3% of us is vaccinated. But the economic uncertainty gripping Australia goes beyond the urgent challenges posed by the pandemic. In fact, much of it predates the pandemic. I'm talking about Australians who don't know how many hours of work they'll be offered from one week to the next, but who do know it won't be enough to pay the bills. Families who, every week, face the fact that childcare costs absorb one parent's entire wage. Older workers worried they will be passed over and then discarded. Worried they don't have enough to save to retire, but may not find another job. Worried about the quality of life they will have as they age and the quality of care they will get when they need it. Then there's the millions of Australians who were rightly praised during the pandemic. Our retail workers, our delivery workers, those in aged care, educators, cleaners, frontline health workers. We celebrated them for keeping the country going and were right to do so. We can't go back to asking carers and teachers and cleaners to do more with less and to continue to struggle through. We can't say to the delivery drivers who kept hundreds of restaurants afloat that we value their job at $10 an hour and their safety at even less. All of this leads us back to where I began, that fundamental test. What are we going to learn from this crisis? And how are we going to change because of it? The pandemic put a spotlight on a host of problems. Everything from the hollowing out of our manufacturing sector and the neglect of our skills and training system to the perils of insecure work and the narrowness of our export base. It's time to decide if we are going to tackle those problems or entrench them. In 100 different ways, the selflessness of Australians has saved our country from the worst of what we've seen elsewhere in the world. And of course, our geography as an island continent has helped too. Virtually overnight, that tyranny of distance became the luxury of isolation. Are we going to seize that advantage or squander it? Are we going to surge forward from our head start or drift back to what we had before? A low growth, low productivity, flat wage economy. This is the fundamental choice for Australia, retreating to more of the same or shape change so the recovery works for everyone. As Prime Minister, I want our country to seize this once-in-a-century moment. This is what investing in Australia's future is all about. Creating Jobs and Skills Australia on the Infrastructure Australia model, to advise on the future work opportunities and to ensure that Australians can benefit from them. Establishing a national reconstruction fund to transform existing industries and jumpstart investment in the industries of tomorrow. fostering partnerships with the private sector to revive our ability to manufacture products right here, to value add, to be more self-reliant, launching a startup year program to drive innovation and increase links between our universities and entrepreneurs. Startup loans will be offered to students and new graduates with ventures attached to tertiary institutions and designated private accelerators. That means the next generation of Australian breakthroughs will create the next generation of Australian jobs. Labor understands that the world's climate challenge is Australia's job opportunity. When I say my vision is for Australia as a renewable energy superpower, I don't just mean as a supplier of energy, but as a designer, manufacturer and exporter of technology to our region and the world. But we know that that just won't happen of its own accord. It needs a commitment to act on climate change, a pathway to net zero emissions, an upgraded electricity grid that can accept and distribute renewable power, and a workforce ready to run with these opportunities. A key part of this is Labor's new energy apprenticeships program to train 10,000 young people for the energy jobs of the future. I want to build an economy that enables people to achieve their aspirations and fulfil their potential. An economy that delivers for working people, that repays people for their sacrifices, that rewards people for their efforts. An economy that works for people, not the other way around. I grew up in a council house raised by a single mum on the disability pension. I know the vital transformative difference that investments in healthcare, education and social housing can make to people in need. I've lived it. But I wasn't brought up believing that Australia owed me a living. I was raised to respect the dignity of work. I was taught that if you worked hard, made sacrifices and saved where you could, you would have enough to pay the bills, keep a roof over your head, to support a family. And back then, that pretty much held true. That same certainty doesn't exist today. And it's not our people who have changed. Australians are still working hard. But the aspirations of so many are being pushed beyond reach. A home, a family, a job that you can make a career, dignity and security in retirement. And so much of that problem is exemplified by the wage stagnation that this 8-year-long government has presided over. A new report released by the McKell Institute this week, Stuck in Neutral, found that wages growth is wallowing at its slowest growth in a generation. Between 2007 and 2013, during the period of the Labor government, during the global financial crisis, the increase in average weekly ordinary time earnings was 4.6%. Between 2014 and 2020, that figure was 2.5%. To put it another way, if this government had done nothing but sustain the same rate of wages growth that existed under the former Labor government, the average worker would be $254 a week better off today. $13,000 a year. That's the cost of wage suppression for ordinary Australians. And now, after 8 years of wages growth being stuck at historic lows, last month's budget forecast actually predicted a 4-year, over the forward estimates, a cut in real wages. So let's be very clear. When my colleagues and I talk about Australians finding it harder to pay rent, make ends meet, put food on the table, it's not a question of feeling, it's a matter of fact. The struggles being put on everyday Australians are the result of this government's choices. 8 years of wage suppression, cutting penalty rates, allowing a surge in temporary work visas, refusing to act on wage theft and exploitation. Of all the decisions I've seen in this parliament over my time here, I think the government moving an amendment to its own legislation earlier this year to remove the provisions in its legislation to criminalise wage theft, when everyone across the parliament said they supported it, was the most breathtaking. The fact is, they've also frozen public sector pay. They've let the gig economy explode whilst failing to protect gig workers. It's because of this the average worker is $254 a week worse off. It's a race being run in the wrong direction. And as so many of you understand, there's a powerful flow-on effect because of this. Because when Australians aren't earning enough to pay for the essentials, the first thing they do is cut back. When families go without, family businesses miss out. Everyone gets hurt when wages stay too low for too long. Something has been identified by the RBA and others. That's why earlier this year I announced our plan to lift wages and make work more secure for more Australians. This includes properly defining casual work, cracking down on the abuse of cowboy labour hire firms to ensure people who do the same job get the same pay, closing the gender pay gap, 10 days paid domestic and family violence leave, making wage theft a crime because stealing from vulnerable workers should be met with the full force of the law. 8 years of wage suppression have stifled economic growth, and that problem has been compounded at every turn by the lack of a coherent plan to boost either productivity or participation. When it comes to participation, the most effective and most obvious step we could take to boost participation in our economy and improve life for families is to reform childcare. And that's why Labor's Cheaper Childcare Plan was one of the first policies I announced as Labor leader. We're going to simplify the system and strip out the disincentives that discourage parents from working and deprive workplaces of valuable, productive and experienced staff. It will cut the cost of childcare for 97% of families. Our reforms will see an 11% increase in the hours worked by women with young children and a boost to economic growth of up to $4 billion a year. We will deliver, over the forward estimates, an additional $6 billion investment, but we want to make sure that this funding flows through to families. Right now, there is little oversight or public reporting of how public funding in childcare is spent. Parents should have more transparency around exactly what they're paying for so they can decide which provider is right for their family. So today I'm announcing that our childcare package will include measures to improve transparency by requiring large providers to publish their childcare revenue and profit results, and by publishing real-time childcare fee data so parents can see what their fees are funding. Labor will also stop the practice of for-profit providers offering inducements, such as free iPads, to entice families to enrol. These are marketing gimmicks and are an inappropriate use of taxpayer dollars. We stand in stark contrast to the Coalition and our support for the childcare sector, knowing how vital it is for Australia's families. And this week we saw an astonishing display of the contempt that some in the Coalition have for working families, with a member of the government saying that women who use childcare are, to quote them, outsourcing parenting. Talk about not understanding how modern life functions for so many families around the country. The level of disrespect in that statement is galling. It shows how out of touch they are. In September 2008, shockwaves from the United States plunged advanced economies around the world into recession. Every advanced economy, that is, of course, except Australia. Our businesses stayed open, our people stayed in work, our banking and lending systems stayed strong. Australia actually grew while every other nation went backwards. That Labor government, in which I was proud to serve as eventually Deputy Prime Minister, but as Leader of the government in the House during that entire period, acted swiftly and acted decisively. Just as we know it's a race now We certainly knew it was a race then. And we matched immediate recession-busting stimulus with long-term nation-building. When we sat around the cabinet table, it wasn't just how do we keep things going, it was how do we invest in a way which boosts that longer-term economic growth, that actually has reform of the economy, that boosts jobs but boosts productivity as well, particularly in infrastructure, including, of course, a fibre-to-the-premise national broadband network, but also life-changing social reforms like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, like the introduction of paid parental leave, and lifting older Australians out of poverty with the largest ever increase in the age pension in our history. That Labor government saw the opportunity that that moment represented, a chance to build for the future, to set Australia up for success in the decade ahead. The hard truth is, though, that we didn't stay in government long enough to see that job through to completion, and the trashing of the NBN with the reintroduction of copper rather than fibre is an example of that. And too much of that good work has been undone in the 8 years since, sometimes with just negative policies, like having no policy on energy or on climate over during that period, but also by cuts, by neglect, by a toxic partisan refusal of the new government to acknowledge the value of anything done by the old government. Now, that's not the approach that I will adopt as Prime Minister. I'm a builder and I believe that government is about building to last. My vision is for an Australia that emerges from this crisis with an economy that is stronger because it's more diverse, more adaptable, more focused on future growth opportunities. An economy that is stronger because we invest in revitalising our traditional industries and backing new innovations. An economy that invests in the productive capacity of our people, in skills and training and apprenticeships. But also an economy that is stronger because it rewards the work of Australians more fairly. An economy built on fair pay and secure work. There is every reason to be optimistic about Australia's future. Every reason to be ambitious for what we can do to turn this once-in-a-century pandemic into a once-in-a-century moment of transformation. Australia has reached the crossroads. All now depends on the path that we take. I'm of the firm view that we should be racing up that path to a better future. Thanks for your attention today.
Anthony, thank you so much for that. I've been having a quick look in the pigeonhole already, which is off script, because I'm supposed to interview you for a little bit and then people are supposed to put their questions through. But there are a lot of questions coming through in the pigeonhole already, which are wanting to know about you and how you would prosecute a role of Prime Minister. Now, I remember the last time you and I had that chat in Perth and you told me about the worst job you've ever had. I think it was also the first job you've ever had, and it involved a pressure washer and eaves and pigeon poo, from memory.
Indeed.
Thank you very much. Here's our coffee.
Thank you.
Lovely. Let's just make sure we've got them the right way around. Yes, perfect. National Cabinet had a lot of attention. So people would like to know, if you were Prime Minister, would you continue with that sort of a focus, and how would you manage that whole business of federal and state relations? And people are admiring some of the things that have gone on recently with Labor in Victoria, levies and taxes and so forth. How would you think about that dynamic? What would you bring to that?
Well, National Cabinet, I think, is a misnomer. It's a slogan. I think it worked in terms of there was a need to bring the state and territory leaders together with the national leadership. Particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, I think it worked very well. I think the National Cabinet stopped being a National Cabinet when there was a meeting on a Sunday, and both the Premier of Victoria and the Premier of New South Wales got together on school closures. And from that point on, it stopped operating as a national body. It became a body where state premiers and chief ministers told each other what they were doing, and then the Prime Minister announced it. And I do have some concern that over a period since the 1970s, really, but particularly was accelerated under Hawke and Keating, and was accelerated under our government as well. You've had a more national approach as the tyranny of distance on this vast island continent became less important, and people move around a lot more, and the idea that people do one job in one community for their lifetime is where they're at. That made more sense. My concern is that this is the first period in decades in which there's been a transfer of power to the states away from the Commonwealth. And that's what we've seen. And I think there's been very little commentary on that, including from the Commonwealth, that's just sat back and allowed all that to happen. The idea, for example, that state governments are in charge of who comes into Australia and how many is quite frankly absurd. The national government controls immigration, it controls customs, it controls quarantine. But you've had a conscious decision by Scott Morrison to not take responsibility because that's a way of avoiding blame. And the things that he did decide to take responsibility for, the rollout of the vaccine, might suggest that it's a good thing he's not in charge of more. But I do worry about that. I worry that the removal of COAG processes has meant that the job of microeconomic reform and productivity building could potentially just disappear. One of the reforms that I'm very proud of doing as a minister, something that I'm sure you're all aware of out there, is moving from 23 transport regulators down to 3. National regulation in heavy vehicles, rail and maritime. That had a boost to the economy of $30 billion over 20 years. The idea that you used to have different, even the absurd example I'd give is 66 head of cattle allowed on the back of trucks in one state and 60 on the other between Queensland and New South Wales. So what do? Get to the border and chuck 6 head of cattle off on the road to go back to their state, and all of the inefficiencies that were there. So I am a firm believer when it comes to the national approach in microeconomic reform, in national consistency, and we've seen far from that. Trying to navigate around this country is a great example of that, and people today watching this online, or indeed people here, some people will be wondering, how do we get home? Are we allowed to go home? What are the rules? Because they're different. And I think with a bit of national leadership, there could have been far more consistency. It was a conscious decision to give up responsibility, and I think that has been unfortunate, and I'm concerned that when you give up power and influence, which is what has happened, very difficult to get it back.
Yeah, that is a very good point for you to lead me into my very next question. You know, it's difficult to give power back. And I think one of the things that business has seen over the last while is government expanding into more areas and talking about it's the health, it's the science, we need to go with this, and being very wary of the accountability discussion around, well, have those decisions been good decisions if you were to consider them in a more broadly based way? Now, we've been making broadly based and nuanced decisions on health matters, taking other things into account. Just a simple one, some pharmaceuticals are on a benefit scheme, some are not. We have to make a decision about that, even though we know that some of those pharmaceuticals that are not on the benefit scheme would be of great support and help to some Australians. So how would you, as Prime Minister, step into that need to, firstly, maybe shrink the boundary of the activities of government back to perhaps where it was before, but also to think about that question of accountability. You know, some countries have already launched reviews into their pandemic response. Tell me how you as Prime Minister would deal with that.
Look, we will certainly need to have a review into how we've handled this issue, because all of the experts tell us this mightn't be the big one. There are other issues in terms of uncertainty, not just in terms of health issues, but the issue of cyber security is a major challenge that we have, as well as the increasing instability, including increasing instability in the region due to, which arises essentially from the changed posture of China being more assertive in the region, and not in a good way in terms of the impact that that's had on our economy and the implications that are there. So we have to, I think, examine how we've dealt with this, and I think by and large, in terms of the response of the Australian people, has been quite remarkable, really. The fact that people have responded to the alert by and large, with a few exceptions obviously, but with incredible discipline. People have been prepared to make that sacrifice. The fact that our health authorities have been listened to experts is a good idea, particularly when it is about the health of ourselves. But we need as well, I think, to have my view about the role of government in a sort of broader sense is, I'm a believer in markets as an effective allocator of resources. Markets are democratic mechanisms. One of my concerns about the current government's attitude towards climate, for example, is that on energy policy, essentially since the election of Abbott, you essentially have had a Soviet-style response, essentially, saying that governments should subsidise rather than look at where markets operate effectively. What's the cheapest form of new energy? The most absurd, of course, is now something that might play out over Collinsville in the idea that you would have a state contribution to a new coal-fired power plant. That doesn't stack up under any circumstances. Money given to a proponent of that project, like taxpayer money given to a proponent of a private sector operation to do a feasibility study. I mean, seriously, if that was put to the Infrastructure Australia board that I established, Sir Rod Eddington would have resigned on the spot. Don't want to verbal him, but it's just completely contrary to good government models in the 21st century. So if you want to look at what my attitude would be towards that, you don't have to theorise. Look at what I did. Infrastructure Australia, a model of private sector representatives, serious people, Sir Rod Eddington, Heather Ridout, Kerry Schott, Gary Weaven, and others, with serious bureaucrats, Ken Henry, Mike Murdoch, the head of PM&C, Treasury, etc., engaged. Senior state bureaucrats as well, in particular Jim Hallion. People, a small, efficient board, a small organisation, not a big bureaucracy. It only had, at its peak, it never reached 20 staff. And what that did was provide public-private partnership uniform guidelines, microeconomic reform, recommend projects that boosted on the basis of productivity rather than on the basis of getting out a map. And every single one of the priority projects that they recommended was funded. And that contrasts with people sitting around offices in this building with colour-coded charts based upon marginality of seats. That's what good government looks like. And that's what Jobs and Skills Australia, for example, that would be based upon that. private sector representatives with the best academic and public sector thought, getting together. Where's the economy going? What skills will we need in the future? How do we attain those skills through TAFE and through other training organisations? How do we encourage workers into that, and be it new workers, young people, or retraining? We've got, to give an example, to offend some people here potentially, everyone can't go into law in universities. We've got lawyers doing different jobs because there's too many people coming out of the sector, but not enough. We don't have enough bricklayers in this country, let alone engineers. If we actually get that right, we can make sure that we not only are looking at the industries of the future, but how Australians can maximise the benefit from it.
Now, I really want to ask you about climate change, because there are a lot of questions coming through in the pigeonhole in all sorts of levels. But it's a new landscape, of course, with new leadership in the Nationals, may bring a very different flavour.
That's a flat earth, that landscape that's there.
Oh, I shouldn't have said that, should I? I opened the door for you to say that. Sorry.
You bowl a full toss, you've got to expect me to hit it.
Right over there to the boundary. That's why my day job is not being an interviewer. But you do have net zero by 2050, but medium-term targets, not yet. So can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, sure.
Because you just said, how important it was with Infrastructure Australia, put the map away, get the projects out. I know there were productivity targets there, so
absolutely.
Talk to me about the difference.
The pathway. Well, one of the things that happened when I became leader of the Labor Party is that I said that we would work on strategy based upon getting into government and then being a good government, not focus on the sort of as much on the 24-hour media cycle. Had we announced our pathway fully, I announced net zero emissions by 2050 in January of 2020. Had we announced further detail in terms of interim measures in 2020, the world's very different in 2021. And one of the things I've been determined to do is to make one announcement, and that's what we would do in government. I remember I did a press conference outside here, and Phil Curry from the Fin Review was saying, what are you doing on interim stuff? And I said, well, next week there's a little event that may well have a bit of an impact. It's called the US election. And it did. We went from President Trump with his erratic decision-making, he says politely, to Joe Biden with a very clear position, an engagement, a re-engagement with the international community and with international leadership. US leadership is vital. I'm a strong supporter of the alliance. I'm a strong supporter of engaging also in multilateral forums. I wrote our policy last time that had ratification of Kyoto as our environment and climate change spokesperson in 2006. They had that 20% renewable energy target by 2020, etc. When we adopted that, by the way, people said the world would end. Our target was, at the time, our national target was 2%. We've achieved 20% in spite of the government. And one of the things that's happening is that there's enormous leadership being shown by the private sector. Like, businesses are just getting on with it in spite of the government. But there are signals being sent that constrain that private sector activity with direct government investment interfering in the market and what the markets are doing, and we've seen examples of that recently and projections of advancements of that. We've seen the G7 adopt a very strong position and in the lead up to Glasgow, of course, will be critical. The world will change after Glasgow. It's inconceivable that there won't be stronger positions adopted internationally at Glasgow. It's also inconceivable that there won't be restrictions placed internationally on those nations which aren't pulling their weight. And it is also, I just wish people in Australia could go to conferences as I did. I went to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Montreal and in Nairobi when John Howard was Prime Minister, and saw how Australia was regarded as a pariah. The last time there was an international conference, you had Australia sitting with Saudi Arabia and a couple of other countries in the Nordic corner. And I'm not sure in this country, including from the media, that there is an understanding of just how we are regarded, and that when people use slogans like technology, not taxes, it's just the reaction that gets in international forums. I think the fact that our Prime Minister, an Australian Prime Minister, could not get a one-on-one meeting with the US President is just extraordinary and unheard of. Unheard of. Our alliance is very important and it will continue. But that's a very conscious decision to send a message. And the spin of, oh no, I wanted to have a meeting with Boris Johnson as well as with Joe Biden, is just nonsense. Complete nonsense. And so on climate, we will be very much watching what happens at Glasgow. What we're doing is rolling out practical plans consistent with net zero emissions by 2050, such as community batteries, such as the things that we've opposed in terms of inappropriate government intervention, such as our opposition. You know, we've copped a bit this week from the absurdity of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, the hint's in the title, ARENA. Australian Renewable Energy Agency should fund renewables. Apparently that's a radical position in this parliament. Frankly, the world is watching us. When people in the US administration hear about that debate, Australia's standing in the world just makes us look just terrible. The elevation of Barnaby Joyce to the Deputy Prime Ministership, you know, whilst on some levels, you know, I've had some of my friends finding it sort of amusing, people who look at the that video of his Christmas message with the cows and looking up at the sky and all of that. It's actually taken seriously on a global phase, and not in a good way, and we you know, will continue to roll out policies as we have, for example, on electric vehicles, to lower the prices by lowering taxation measures, by changing FBT, and we'll continue to provide support where governments are doing good things. And the New South Wales Liberal government had a very positive, constructive announcement about electric vehicles, for example. You know, we have a debate in this country where we were told that would end the weekend, literally. Like the Prime Minister and senior ministers in a government saying something that is a transition that's happening. There is no car manufacturer in the world that is doing research into a new internal combustion engine. That was the case when I was the minister, attending conferences in Japan. There was a global transport ministers conference where I was frankly, because I'm here in Australia, was surprised at just how strong Japanese auto was, and at that stage the US administration was about the Parliament, going back, was about where these things were headed. Now, that's just a fact. You can't be, and that's why in the speech I spoke about being scared of the present, terrified of the future. You've got to actually shape the future. You can't pretend it's not happening. And it is happening. It's a matter of whether we've lost first mover advantage, whether we take advantage of the opportunities that are there. We're in the fastest growing region of the world in human history. That presents us with an incredible opportunity. If you were designing Australia, you design it so the sun was shining in the west coast when the east coast was using most energy as well. You'd fix the grid, you'd fix transmission, you'd do all that, and I think we can really prosper from good action on climate change. But we can't while the government's incapable of moving forward.
There's a huge task there to be done. So, but just to be clear, you're Prime Minister, you're signing up to global climate change agreements. Yep.
Absolutely, we'll participate. We'll participate in Australia's interest.
With a pen and a wet signature?
Look, we will always be a part of international, we used to, and, the current government, just a little while ago, was going down, and they think this wasn't noticed either, was going down the Trumpian road of speaking about negative globalism. Remember that? Not that long ago. We have the only democratic leader in the world who refused to condemn the insurrection on the Capitol building at the beginning of this year. If you think that wasn't noticed, I assure you it was.
Well, let's then turn to some of that. I'll give you a choice here. There's two questions. The first one is, what specifically would you do about China? Your alternative question is, who will South Sydney beat to claim the NRL Premiership this year?
Well, we'll beat either Melbourne or Penrith, that's easy.
Okay, so now, not so easy. What specifically would you do about China?
Well, I think we need to recognise that China has got more aggressive. And we need to recognise that China is responsible for changing the relationship. But it doesn't mean that you can't have an economic relationship as governments in the past have done. We need to recognise that they're not a democracy. They do have a different system, and they are operating in a way that is more forward-leaning in terms of their interests under Xi, and that for China, I think that when you look at that, that requires a response in terms of our national sovereignty and our national interests. So we should always speak up for human rights. We should always speak up for our own interests. But that doesn't mean that we can't adopt a position which is consistent with the position of the Biden administration, who speak about competition without catastrophe. And I think that is the key. It's in no one's interest in Australia, I don't think, to talk up conflict, but it is in our interest to make sure that we recognise that we're living in a circumstance whereby competition between the world's two great powers is there. We picked a side under Labor when we formed the US alliance, and we were right to do so, to have those relationships with our democratic partners as being priorities. But we also have to, and part of competition without catastrophe is looking at things from other countries' perspective, not to adopt that, but at least to understand it. And two, I think China deserves enormous credit for lifting more people out of poverty over recent decades than anything we have seen in human history, by a long, long way. And that achievement is extraordinary. And that is a positive thing, and with that has come some benefits for Australia in terms of our trading relationship. But we also, I think, as we go forward, need to recognise that because technology transfer is ubiquitous, unlike what happened with previous revolutions, with the Industrial Revolution, essentially was a transference of power from the east to the west as a result of the steam engine and coal and power. And that meant that it was technology that drove growth rather than population. Now, because technology is neutral, population is driving growth, which is why you will see China emerge as the largest economy in the world. You'll see India emerge in recent, over the period as sort of at least third. You will see Indonesia be one of the top 5 economies in the world as well. That presents an incredible opportunity for us. And because of the nature of technology and the changing nature of work as well, it also presents an opportunity for us, whereas we had seen jobs in manufacturing transfer offshore because of labour costs, essentially. With the changing nature of the production cycle, with labour being less as a proportion of the costs of production, then our natural advantages in terms of manufacturing things here, because transportation under the model of we have resources, you export them overseas, labour adds value, then you import it back or export it somewhere else. Because that has changed, the opportunity that is here for us to be a manufacturer in areas like producing batteries for cars, and something in the order of 1 in 4, it might even be higher, of batteries around the world has nickel that come from your great state of WA, from the refinery there at Kwinana, which BHP operates. There's an opportunity for us to create more jobs, high-value manufacturing here. And part of my vision for the country is exactly that. How do we take advantage of the opportunities that are there? And if we do that, I think we can be less dependent as well on one country, which we have been under this government in particular for all of some of the statements that they've made. The truth is that we are more dependent on trade with China than we have been in the past. And we need to be more self-reliant, which is one of the themes of the speech that I've given today.
Yes, I was very interested in, and we've got time for just one last question and a maybe quick answer to that. You talked about this startup ecosystem and trying to engender a bit more excitement around that from universities. There's a lot of interest in the room on Pigeonhole about digital economy, and I'm assuming that you would think that those two things might be put together. Why did you choose that particular thing to focus on?
Because when, just to give one example, going to Singapore, where I spent some time a little while ago, I went there. You have more time in opposition. Well, more time when you're not opposition leader, I've got to say. That's ended. I had a week there, and there were two things really hit home I took out of that. One was sitting down with the telecommunications, looking at digital and looking at their model of what they'd built. And it was the National Broadband Network. They'd taken what we had done but not buggered it up, essentially. Not continued to have a debate about, is copper better than fibre, sort of nonsense that went on here with the so-called hybrid model, which of course has cost more than the original plan would have. So that was one thing. And the second was going to a startup place attached to the university there. And there were all these Australians there, and Australian-based innovators and entrepreneurs. And it was like, hang on, why are they there and not back home? I had something similar in Hyderabad in 2000 and before the election I visited there, so I think it was 2018, the end of 2018, I led a delegation there. We are great at ideas and innovation. Every solar breakthrough in the world, just about, I'm sure someone will, you have a lot of smart people watching, someone will say, what about this? But just about everyone has come from either the Australian National University or the University of New South Wales. What benefit have we got from that? A bit, but not as much as we should have.
Yeah, it is
Nowhere
interesting.
near. Nowhere near.
I saw a similar thing in Israel where when they created automatic sensing technology, the government then immediately turned around and said, well, you can't register a car if you don't put it on your car. You know, I think that's the sort of thing we'd love to see.
How do we take advantage of that? You know, all the people watching this using Wi-Fi. Here, we did it.
Yeah, we did.
We did it. And yet what we've had is, you know, cuts to the CSIRO. We've had a lack of recognition of that, and we can be much better at it. And the idea of startups coming from work that Ed Husick has done is very much the case of, okay, how do we encourage those connections between universities and business entrepreneurs in order to commercialise those opportunities and maximise the national benefit?
Thank you. I think that's a great point on which to finish. Thank you everyone for joining us today, whether you're here in the Great Hall or watching on the live stream. And Anthony Albanese, thanks very much for your thoughts. We love to have you on the CEDA stage.
It's very civilised, I've got to say, having a coffee while we're having a chat.
It is rather nice, isn't it? And you know, I really appreciate your openness to talk about, you know, how you would prosecute the role of Prime Minister, because I think it's a very important thing for people to understand. And I was particularly struck with your very positive comments about markets. So, you know, I would have to be struck by that one, of course, as a business person. But I think that blending, I also thought your observations around, you know, how government has changed through COVID and how you might take approaches towards ensuring that the good was kept and the not so good left behind was really a helpful point. Our next session is on risk and opportunity. How do we get the cyber balance right? Which will include Home Affairs Minister Karen Andrews, and I think that's a hugely relevant topic. So I hope everyone will enjoy the rest of the sessions. Now, I was really hoping that Sharon Braun from CEDA would have actually found her way into the room at some point, because I really did want to thank her for all of her flexibility in pulling this together. So can we together thank Anthony Albanese for this wonderful thing and Sharon Braun for being a great employee at CEDA. Thank you,
Good morning, everybody, and we're about to start our session on cybersecurity, risk and opportunity. How do we get the cyber balance right? It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all, ladies, gentlemen and distinguished guests. My name is Rosemary Sinclair and I'm the CEO of CEDA, who is responsible for administering Australia's internet domain, better known as the .au, at the end of your email address and at the end of Australian web addresses. Interesting factoid, we process every day 3 billion messages, people looking for websites or sending emails. So as we all know, and if we didn't, we've certainly learnt over the last 15 months, life on the internet is very busy but very important.